What would you do if the only thing you could afford in the entire world was a grave? Not a plot in some quiet cemetery, but a hole in the ground, so forgotten the rest of the world had already stopped speaking its name. Imagine being 17 years old, standing in the dust of an Arizona mining town in 1882, with nothing to your name but $2 silver, a tarnished locket that once belonged to your dead mother, and a grief so heavy it felt like a second skeleton inside your own. That was the world Wren Holloway walked into the day she arrived in Stillwater Bend. She came looking for her father's grave. She left having dug up something far worse. Because the collapsed mine shaft she bought for $2 silver, the one the entire town laughed at her for, the one a man named Cyrus Whitlock offered her $200 to walk away from, was not just a hole in the ground. It was a tomb. It was a vault. It was a confession written in stone and silence. And the man who sealed it shut 10 years ago, the richest, most respected man in the territory, was standing in the crowd that afternoon, laughing the loudest of them all. He had no idea that the quiet, dust-covered girl bidding against him had just bought the one thing in the world that could destroy him. So settle in and let us know where you're watching from, because this is the story of a girl who went looking for her father and instead found a reckoning 10 years in the making. The wagon road into Stillwater Bend ran straight through a country that did not forgive anything. Red rock on either side, broken by clumps of brittle sage and the bleached white bones of cattle that had wandered too far from water. The sky above was the color of beaten tin, and the sun pressed down on the back of Wren Holloway's neck like the flat of a hot iron. She had been walking for 4 days. The leather of her boots had cracked along the seams. The hem of her gray dress was stiff with dust the color of old blood. Inside her pocket, $2 knocked together with every step a small, dull music that had become the only sound she trusted. She was 17 years old, and she was alone in a way that most people would never understand. Her Aunt Hester had died 3 weeks ago in a small wooden house outside of Bandera, Texas. The fever had come in the spring, like it always did, riding the warm wind up from the Gulf. And it had taken Hester the way it took most old women, slowly then, all at once. Wren had buried her under a live oak tree at the edge of the property, dug the grave herself, because there was no one else to do it, and sat beside the fresh mound of earth for 2 days without eating. When she finally stood up, she walked back into the empty house, and she found the letter. It was in a tin box beneath the floorboards of her aunt's bedroom. The box was rusted at the corners, and the lid did not want to open. Inside, wrapped in a square of yellowed muslin, was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting on it was not her aunt's. It was older, sharper, written in a hand she did not recognize. The date at the top said October 1872. The words below were brief and they were brutal. Hester, Silas is dead. He went back to Stillwater Bend in August and did not come out. I have made inquiries through a man I trust. The story being told is cholera. I do not believe it. Keep the girl in Texas. Keep her quiet. Do not write to me again at this address. May God forgive us all. The letter was unsigned. Wren had been 7 years old in 1872. She remembered the year only as the year her mother died and her father went away. Her aunt had told her both things in the same sentence, sitting on the porch of the Bandera house with the smell of wood smoke in the air. Your mama is gone, child. Your daddy is gone too, but a different kind of gone. He had a sickness in his heart that no doctor could cure, and he went off to look for a cure in the silver country, and the cure did not find him. That was the story Wren had carried inside her for 10 years. A father who had loved her too little to stay, and a mother who had simply faded away one winter, coughing into a white handkerchief that had turned slowly, terribly red. The letter in the tin box did not match that story. The letter said that her father had not faded. The letter said that her father had been killed. And the letter said the name of the place where it had happened, a name Wren had never heard spoken in her aunt's house, not once in 10 long years. Stillwater Bend. She left Texas the next morning with everything she owned in a single canvas satchel. A change of clothes, her aunt's Bible, her father's old tin canteen dented on one side with the initials S.H. scratched into the bottom, and around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her dress, the only thing she had left of her mother, a small silver locket on a thin silver chain. Inside it was no photograph, only a tiny lock of dark hair tied with a piece of red thread. Her mother's hair. Iris Halloway, dead of consumption in the winter of 1872 or so. The story had always gone. Wren did not know what she would find in Arizona. She only knew that she could not stay in the empty house in Bandera. She could not sit on that porch and listen to the wind move through the live oak above her aunt's grave and pretend that the world was the world her aunt had described to her. Something in that letter had cracked the world open, and she had to walk through the crack and see what was on the other side. So she walked. She rode in the back of a freight wagon for 2 days, and then she walked again. She slept under the stars, and she drank from creeks that tasted of iron, and she chewed strips of dried beef until her jaw ached. And on the 4th day, when the sun was high and merciless, she came over the last rise in the wagon road, and she saw it below her in the valley. Stillwater Bend. It was not much of a town. A dozen plank buildings huddled together against the indifference of the desert. A single dusty main street. A wooden church with a crooked steeple at one end. A livery stable at the other. The shadows of the buildings were short and sharp in the noon light. A few horses stood tied to a hitching post in front of a saloon, their tails swishing slowly at flies. A wagon sat broken-wheeled in front of the blacksmith's. There was no music. There was no laughter. There was only the dry, hot breath of the wind moving down the empty street. Wren stood on the rise, and she looked down at the town that had killed her father, and she felt nothing. No fear, no anger, no grief. Just a hollow, flat space inside her chest where those things should have been. She had used them all up on the road. She started down the hill toward the town, and the dust rose around her ankles, and the silver dollars in her pocket knocked together with every step. The town watched her come. She felt their eyes before she saw them. A pair of old men on the saloon porch, their faces shaded by the brims of dirty hats, paused their slow conversation to follow her with their gaze. A woman in a faded blue dress sweeping the boardwalk in front of a small dressmaker's shop stopped her sweeping and stood with the broom held still against her hip. A boy of maybe 10 leading a mule down the street turned his head and stared at her with open curiosity. Wren kept her eyes forward. She had walked into 100 strange towns in the last 4 days, and she had learned that the trick was not to flinch. The trick was to walk like you had a reason for being there, even when you did not, because a stranger without a reason was a stranger. People felt entitled to ask questions of. She passed the marshal's office, a low adobe building with a wooden plank above the door that said, T. Renshaw Town Marshal in faded black paint. She passed the assayer's office. She passed a mercantile with barrels of flour stacked outside and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, Whitlock and Company. She filed the name away in her memory without knowing why. And then, just beyond the mercantile, she saw the land office, and she saw the notice tacked to the wooden post beside its door, and she stopped walking. The notice was sun-bleached and curling at the corners, the paper so thin it looked as though a strong wind would tear it loose. It announced the auction of delinquent claims to be held that same afternoon at 3 o'clock. There were 6 claims listed. 5 of them had back taxes owed in the hundreds of dollars, sums Wren could not have imagined paying if she had worked for a lifetime. But the 6th claim was different. The 6th claim was listed at $1. Lot 73, a collapsed mine shaft 3 miles north of town, described as unworkable, abandoned, and structurally unsound. Reserve price $1. Beside the entry in smaller handwritten letters, someone had added a kind of joke. The words were faded but still legible. Halloway's Folly. Wren stood in front of the notice and she did not breathe. The wind moved her dust-stiff dress against her legs. A horse stamped somewhere down the street. Her own name, her father's name, was written on a paper, tacked to a post, in a town 1,000 miles from anywhere listed as a joke against a worthless hole in the ground. She read it 3 times. She made sure. And then she reached up and she ran her fingertip along the letters of his name very gently. the way you might touch a bruise to see if it still hurt. Holloway's Folly. The name burned itself into her like a brand. She turned away from the notice and she looked up the street, and her eyes found the wooden plank above the mercantile door. Whitlock and Company. The same name she had heard her aunt mutter once long ago in her sleep. A name her aunt had never spoken aloud while awake. A name that had not meant anything to Wren then, and that meant only one thing to her now. She had $2 silver in her pocket. The auction was in 3 hours. She walked toward the boarding house at the end of the street, and her boots made no sound in the deep dust. The boarding house was run by a thin woman with the disappointed mouth of someone who had been promised more by life than life had been willing to deliver. Her name was Mrs. Polk, and she charged 10 cents for a tin cup of water and 20 cents for a heel of bread and a wedge of yellow cheese, and she did not smile when Wren paid her. She watched Wren eat in the corner of the small, dim dining room, and when Wren was done, Mrs. Polk asked her what business she had in Stillwater Bend. Wren said she was passing through. Mrs. Polk looked at her dust-caked dress and her cracked boots and her empty hands, and she said, passing through to where exactly? Wren did not answer. She paid for the water and the bread with her smaller coins, and she walked back out into the sun. She was sitting on a bench in the shade of the church when the old woman spoke to her. The old woman had come up so quietly that Wren had not heard her approach. She was small and bent her gray hair pulled back into a single thin braid. Her face mapped with the deep, soft wrinkles of a woman who had spent 70 years in the desert wind. Her dress was black and plain, and her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes, when Wren turned to look at her, were the pale, clouded blue of water seen through ice. Iris's eyes, the old woman said. The voice was a dry whisper, hardly more than the sound of paper rubbed together. Wren went very still. The bench beneath her felt suddenly far away, as though she were sitting on it and watching herself sit on it from a great height. She turned her head slowly, and she looked at the old woman, and the old woman was looking back at her with no expression at all, only that pale, clouded gaze. "You knew my mother," Wren said. The old woman did not answer. She looked at Wren for a long moment, and then she looked down at her own folded hands, and she said in the same dry whisper, "You should not be here, child. You should not have come." "Tell me about her," Wren said. "Please." The old woman shook her head once slowly. "Not in the street," she said. "Not in the daylight. You come to my house tonight after dark, the small adobe behind the livery, and bring nothing with you that anyone in this town has given you. I am Mercy Tolliver. I knew your mother when she was younger than you are now. I held her hand when she died. That is all I will say in the open air." She stood then, with surprising quickness for a woman of her age, and she walked away down the street toward the livery without looking back. Wren watched her go, and she did not move for a long time. Inside her chest, the hollow, flat space where her grief had been was no longer hollow. Something was beginning to fill it. Something hot and small and dangerous, like a single coal carried in the palm of the hand. I held her hand when she died. The auction began at 3 o'clock on the steps of the land office, and a crowd of perhaps 30 men had gathered to watch it. They were prospectors, mostly sunburned and lean, with the careful, patient eyes of men who had spent their lives waiting for the earth to give up its secrets. There were a few merchants among them, and the town's banker, a thin man in a black coat. And there was one other man standing near the front, dressed in a clean gray duster and a wide-brimmed hat, the color of fresh cream, with a silver watch chain across his vest, and the easy posture of a man who had never in his life been told no. Wren stood at the back of the crowd, and she did not need to ask who he was. The other men leaned a little away from him without seeming to know they were doing it. The auctioneer, a sweating, round-shouldered man with a paper in his hand, looked at him before he began, the way a dog looks at its owner for permission. The man in the gray duster did not look back. He was looking out at the crowd, and his face was pleasant and untroubled, the face of a man who had come to watch a small entertainment. Cyrus Whitlock. The name moved through the crowd in low murmurs, and Wren heard it 3 times before the auction began. Mr. Whitlock, the boss. Mr. Whitlock owns this lot too, you know. Mr. Whitlock owns most everything within a day's ride. The auctioneer worked his way through the first 5 claims quickly. Bids were placed in flat-tired voices. A claim near the river went to a prospector for $120. A claim on the south slope went to Whitlock himself for $200. He did not raise his hand. He simply tipped his chin a fraction of an inch, and the auctioneer noted it and moved on. By the time the 6th claim was called, the crowd had begun to grow restless, ready for the auction to end, so they could return to the saloon and the shade. Lot 73, the auctioneer called out, wiping his face with a folded handkerchief. The collapsed shaft north of town, the Holloway place. A ripple of dry laughter moved through the men. One of them, an older prospector with a tobacco-stained beard, called out something that Wren did not quite hear, and the men around him laughed harder. Cyrus Whitlock did not laugh. He smiled a small, thin smile, and he said in a clear, pleasant voice that carried easily over the crowd, $1 for the paperwork, I suppose. Someone has to clean up the records. The auctioneer nodded. $1 from Mr. Whitlock. Do I hear 2? There was a silence. The men shuffled their feet. The auctioneer raised his small wooden gavel. $2. Wren had said it quietly, but the crowd had gone so still that her voice carried. Every head turned. The auctioneer froze with the gavel raised. Cyrus Whitlock turned slowly, his hand resting easily on the silver watch chain at his vest, and he looked at her for the first time. His eyes were a flat, pale gray, the color of slate that has been rained on, and they did not blink as they took her in. the dust on her dress, the thinness of her shoulders, the cracked leather of her boots, the way her hands hung empty at her sides. The crowd began to laugh. Not all of them. Some of them only smiled the way men smile at the foolishness of children. But the older prospector with the tobacco-stained beard laughed loud and long, and several others joined him, and the laughter rolled around Wren like a small private weather of its own. She did not move. She did not look at any of them. She kept her eyes on Cyrus Whitlock, and Cyrus Whitlock kept his eyes on her, and the smile on his face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A small flicker, a small, careful adjustment, as though he had just noticed a card in a hand of cards he had thought he understood. $2 from the young lady, the auctioneer said. He sounded almost apologetic. Do I hear 3? Cyrus Whitlock raised one gloved hand just slightly, an elegant small gesture. No, he said. The young lady can have it. Let her have her grave. The men laughed again, louder this time. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. Sold, he said, for $2 too. He paused. He looked at Wren. To miss, he said. Wren walked forward through the parting crowd. She did not look at the men on either side of her. She did not look at Cyrus Whitlock, though she could feel his eyes on her with every step. She placed her $2 silver on the wooden counter inside the land office, and the clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, slid a folded paper across the counter to her. The deed. Her own name written on it in fresh black ink. Wren Holloway, Lot 73. She folded the paper carefully, and she put it inside the pocket of her dress against the warm, dry skin above her hip, and she walked back out into the sunlight. Cyrus Whitlock was waiting for her on the wooden steps of the land office. He had taken off his hat. He held it in his hand against his chest, and his hair, which was the color of old iron, was combed back from a high, pale forehead. He was a tall man, taller than she had realized from the back of the crowd, and his face up close was a handsome face, the face of a man who had been told many times in his life that he was handsome. But up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the way the skin at the corners of his mouth had begun to fold. He was perhaps 50 years old. He smelled of bay rum and cigar smoke and something else, something faint and chemical, like the smell of a chemist's shop. Miss Holloway, he said. His voice was warm. He had clearly heard her name from the clerk inside. He turned the word over in his mouth as though tasting it. Wren said nothing. She held the deed in her pocket. She looked up at him, and she waited. Forgive me, he said, for the rough talk back there. The men get carried away. He smiled a kind smile, the smile of an uncle at a family gathering. Auctions are a kind of theater out here. We do them for the sport of it. He paused, and his pale gray eyes moved over her face, and the smile did not change. "May I ask," he said, "where you are from, miss?" "Texas," Wren said. "Texas," he repeated. "A long way from home. And what brings a young lady from Texas to a place like Stillwater Bend?" Wren looked at him. She thought of the letter in the tin box. She thought of the name on the post. She thought of the old woman in the black dress saying I held her hand when she died. "I bought a mine," Wren said. Cyrus Whitlock laughed. It was a soft, polite laugh, the laugh of a man who has heard a clever remark at a dinner party. "So you did," he said. "So you did." He put on his hat. He adjusted the brim. And then, very casually, as though it had just occurred to him, he said, "You know, miss that piece of land you just bought. It is not really worth what you paid for it. The shaft collapsed 10 years ago. The frame is rotten. The walls are unstable. A young woman trying to work it alone, well, it would not end well. I have seen it happen." Wren did not answer. "I will tell you what Cyrus Whitlock said." He reached inside his coat and he drew out a small leather wallet, and from the wallet he counted out slowly and deliberately a stack of paper bills. He held them out to her on the flat of his palm. $200, he said. "A fair price, more than fair. You can take that money and you can go anywhere you want. San Francisco, Denver, back to Texas if Texas is what you want. You will not have to scratch in the dirt for a single day of your life." He smiled again. $200, miss, for $1 worth of paperwork." Wren looked at the bills. They were crisp and clean, the corners sharp. She had never in her life seen so much money in one place. $200 was more money than her Aunt Hester had earned in 3 years of taking in laundry and mending. $200 was enough to buy a small house and a milk cow and a year of food. She looked up from the bills. She looked at Cyrus Whitlock's face. The smile was still there. The pale gray eyes were still kind. But behind the kindness, very deep, very far away, there was something else. A tightness around the eyes. A pulse at the side of his throat, just above his collar, that beat a little too quickly. He wanted the deed. He wanted it the way a starving man wants bread, and he was trying very hard not to show it, and the effort of not showing it was costing him something. A man who offers you $200 for a thing he just called worthless is not offering you the price of the thing. He is offering you the price of his silence about the thing. "No, thank you," Wren said. The smile on Cyrus Whitlock's face did not move. It stayed exactly where it was fixed in place, like a smile painted on a doll. Only the eyes changed. The kindness drained out of them slowly, the way water drains from a cracked cup, and what was left behind was the flat, pale gray of slate in the rain. He closed his hand around the bills. He put the bills back into the wallet and the wallet back into his coat. and the smile slowly came back into his eyes. But it was a different smile now, a smile with teeth behind it.
"Suit yourself, miss," he said. He tipped his hat to her. "It is your grave. You dig it as you see fit."
He turned and he walked down the steps of the land office, and he walked back up the street toward the mercantile, and the men on the saloon porch watched him go, and one of them spat tobacco juice into the dust and laughed. Wren stood on the steps, and she watched until the door of Whitlock and Company closed behind him. Then she stepped down into the street, and she walked toward the mercantile herself, because she still needed a shovel. The clerk inside the mercantile would not meet her eyes. He took her last silver coins for the cheapest shovel on the rack, a battered second-hand thing with a long pine handle and a blade that had been resharpened so many times the edge of it was thin as a knife. He wrapped the deed inside no paper. He gave her no change. He pushed the shovel across the counter, and he turned away before she could say thank you. She walked out of the mercantile with the shovel across her shoulder, and she walked north out of town, and the road climbed up into the hills, and the town fell away behind her into the bowl of the valley. Lot 73 was 3 miles north of Stillwater Bend, at the end of a thin track that wound up between 2 stone ridges into a small, high meadow that the desert had not entirely conquered. There were yucca plants here, and a few stunted juniper trees, and a thin trickle of water that came down from a spring somewhere higher up and disappeared into the rocks before it had gone 50 feet. The collapsed shaft was at the back of the meadow, set into the base of a low cliff. Wren saw it from a quarter-mile away, and her steps slowed. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not just a fallen entrance. The entire face of the cliff had come down a slide of broken rock and shattered timbers and packed brown earth that lay in a long, sloping heap against the base of the wall, perhaps 40 feet wide and 20 feet high. The timbers were bleached gray by 10 years of sun. The rocks were sharp and angular, and they looked as though no human hand had ever touched them. Above the slide, the cliff face was scarred where the rock had broken away. Below it, the meadow grass had grown over the lower edges of the debris, as though the earth itself had begun to take the place back to bury what was already buried. Wren stood at the edge of the slide, and she set the shovel down beside her, and she sat down in the meadow grass. And for a long time she did not move. The wind moved across the meadow. The sun began to slide down the western sky, and the shadows of the juniper trees grew long. A hawk wheeled high above the cliff, a small black mark against the blue. Wren sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the slide, and she let herself feel for the first time in 4 days the full weight of what she had done. She had spent every coin she owned. She had bought a hole in the ground that was not even a hole anymore. She had refused $200 from the richest man in the territory. She had no food and no shelter and no money for either, and the sun was going to go down in 3 hours, and she did not know where she would sleep. She put her face into her hands, and she did not cry because she had used up her crying on the road back in Texas. But she sat very still, and she breathed in and out slowly. and she let the panic move through her and out the other side. When she lifted her head again, the shadows in the meadow had grown longer, and the hawk was gone, and the slide of rock and timbers stood in front of her, as it had stood for 10 years, as it would stand long after she was dead, unless she herself moved it. She thought of the old woman's voice in the shade beside the church. I held her hand when she died. She thought of Cyrus Whitlock's smile. Let her have her grave. She thought of her father's name written on a paper tacked to a post, written there as a joke, as a slur, as a small, bright cruelty that the town had carried in its mouth for 10 years like a piece of hard candy. Halloway's Folly. Wren Halloway stood up from the meadow grass. She picked up her shovel. She walked to the edge of the slide. She did not know how she was going to move 40 feet of rock and timber with a single second-hand shovel and her own 2 hands. She did not know how she was going to eat tomorrow. She did not know what was buried inside that cliff, or whether anything was buried inside it at all, or whether her father's name had been a joke for 10 years, because there had never been anything in there but his foolishness. She did not know any of that, but she knew that the man in the gray duster had offered her $200 for a worthless hole, and she knew that the old woman had said, "Come to my house tonight after dark," and she knew that the dust at the base of the slide, when she looked at it closely, had a strange dark color to it, as though it had been mixed with another kind of dirt that had been hauled here from somewhere else. She lifted the shovel. She drove the blade down into the loose scree at the base of the slide. The blade bit. She levered the handle back, and a small avalanche of stones rattled down the slope and came to rest at her feet. She bent down. She picked up a fist-sized rock. She turned it over in her hand. The rock was warm from the sun and rough against her palm, and she thought very clearly, the old woman told me to listen with my hands. The old woman had not used those words, but it was what she had meant. Inside, a single candle was burning. She could see the soft yellow light of it through the cracks around the door frame. She could see the shadow of an old woman moving slowly across the wall. The door opened before she knocked. Mercy Tolliver stood in the doorway, her face lit from below by the candle in her hand, her pale, clouded eyes fixed on Wren's face. She did not speak. She did not smile. She simply stepped aside, and she made a small gesture with her free hand, the gesture of a woman inviting another woman into a room where something terrible was about to be said. Wren stepped over the threshold. The door closed behind her. And outside, in the cold dark of the desert night, a horse stamped once in the livery, and the wind moved down the empty street of Stillwater Bend, and somewhere in a fine large house at the edge of town, Cyrus Whitlock sat alone in a leather chair by a low fire, turning a small silver watch over and over in his fingers. and thinking with great care about what to do next. The adobe house smelled of dried sage and wood smoke and something else, something older, something that lived in the seams of old plaster and the corners of small rooms where old women had spent their whole lives. A single candle burned on a wooden table in the center of the room. The walls were bare except for a small wooden crucifix above the door and a faded photograph in a tin frame on a shelf. The photograph too far away in the dim light for Wren to make out. 2 chairs stood beside the table. Mercy Tolliver moved to one of them, and she sat down slowly the way a person sits down when every joint in her body has been speaking to her for the last 40 years, and she gestured Wren to the other chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The candle flame bent and straightened in the small draft that came under the door. Outside, the wind moved against the adobe walls with the long, low sound of a thing wanting to come in. Mercy looked at Wren across the table, and her pale, clouded eyes seemed to take a long time to what they were. Take that thing out of your dress, Mercy said at last. Wren did not understand. The locket, Mercy said. Around your neck. Take it out where I can see it. Wren reached up under the collar of her dust-stiff dress, and she drew out the small silver locket on its thin silver chain. She let it rest on top of the gray cloth above her heart. The candlelight caught the worn surface of the silver and gave it back a small, dull shine. Mercy did not move for a long time. She only looked at the locket, and her face, which had seemed carved out of dry desert wood, began very slowly to soften the way a hard thing softens when it has been held for a long time in a warm hand. Her mouth moved once without sound. Then she closed her eyes and she breathed out. And when she opened her eyes again, there was a wet shine at the edges of them. I gave that to your mother, Mercy said. The summer she was 14 years old, there was a peddler came through with a tray of such things, and your mother stood looking at it for the better part of an hour, and I had $2 saved from a baby I had delivered, and I bought it for her. She wore it every day of her life after that. She was wearing it the day she died. I took it from her neck myself, and I put it in a tin box, and I sent the tin box east to a woman named Hester in Texas. I never knew if it arrived. I never knew if anything I sent ever arrived. Wren's hand went up to the locket and closed around it. The silver was cold against her palm. Inside her chest, the small, hot coal she had been carrying since the bench beside the church grew suddenly larger. You knew, my mother, Wren said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how it was steady. I knew her from the day she was born, Mercy said, until the day she died. I pulled her out of her own mother with these 2 hands. I taught her how to ride. I taught her how to shoot. I taught her how to read the country the way the old Papago women had taught me. Your mother was not a woman like the women in this town are women now. Your mother was something else.
Mercy paused. She reached out across the table and she laid one thin hand over Wren's hand where it rested on the wood. The hand was light and dry, as light as a leaf that had stopped being green. Child Mercy said, "I am going to tell you some things tonight, and when I am done telling them, you are going to wish I had not told you. But there is no one else left who knows them, and I am 78 years old, and I have been waiting for someone to come for 10 years, and I will not lie to you now." Wren did not speak. She turned her hand over beneath Mercy's hand, and she held the old woman's fingers. "Your mother found that mine," Mercy said. "Not your father. Your mother. In the spring of 1871, before you were 2 years old, your mother rode up into those hills with a hammer and a chisel and a piece of paper, and she came down 3 days later with a sample of ore in her saddlebag, and she walked into the assayer's office in this town, and she filed the claim under her own name. Iris Halloway. Not Mrs. Silas Halloway. Iris Halloway in her own hand. She was the first woman in this territory to file a silver claim alone. Some of the men laughed. Some of them did not laugh. One of them did not laugh at all. Whitlock Wren said. Mercy nodded once. "He was a younger man then," Mercy said. "Not so polished, not so smooth. He had come out from St. Louis 2 years before with a stake from his father, and he had bought a small shaft on the south slope, and he was working it the way men work things by hiring other men to break their backs while he sat in his office and counted. He saw your mother file that claim, and he saw the sample of ore she laid on the assayer's counter, and he knew within a week what she had found. The vein she had hit was a thing that comes along once in a generation. It was not silver. It was tellurium ore, the kind that carries gold inside the silver, the kind that turns a poor man into a rich man in a single season. And Cyrus Whitlock wanted it. He wanted it the way a wolf wants meat. "She did not sell," Wren said. "She did not sell," Mercy said. He came to her 3 times. The first time he offered her $500. The second time he offered her 1,000. The third time he offered her 3,000, which was a sum that was almost impossible to imagine in this country in that year. Your mother sat on the porch of the small house she had with your father, and she rocked you on her knee, and she looked at Cyrus Whitlock standing in her yard with his hat in his hand, and she told him no. She told him the mine was her daughter's inheritance, and her daughter's daughter's inheritance, and that she would dig it with her own hands for the rest of her life before she sold a single foot of it to a man like him. She used that phrase, "a man like him." I was there. I heard her say it. Cyrus Whitlock did not raise his voice. He put on his hat, and he tipped it to her, and he walked away. And 6 weeks later, your mother was dead. Mercy stopped. The candle flame trembled. Outside, the wind shifted, and somewhere down the street, a dog began to bark a small, thin barking that went on for a long time before it stopped. The story in this town, Mercy said, is that Iris Halloway died of consumption. The story is that she had been weak in the lungs since the year you were born, and that the winter of 1872 was a hard winter, and that the cough took her in February. That is the story. It is in the church register. It is on the small stone in the cemetery at the edge of town. It is what every man and woman in Stillwater Bend will tell you if you ask. It is a lie. Wren's hand tightened on Mercy's hand. She could feel the small, fine bones of the old woman's fingers under the skin. Your mother was poisoned, Mercy said. She was poisoned slowly over 6 weeks with arsenic. I have seen consumption 100 times in this country, and I have seen arsenic poisoning twice, and I know the difference. Consumption takes the lungs. Arsenic takes the stomach, and then the hands, and then the feet, and then the mind. Your mother's hair began to fall out 3 weeks before she died. Her fingernails turned a pale blue color. She could not keep food down. She told me in the last week that she had begun to taste copper in her water. I knew then. I knew, and I could not prove it, and I could not say it. I bathed her body when she died. I dressed her. I closed her eyes. And I never spoke a word of what I knew to a living soul, because your father was sitting in the next room with you on his knee. And I knew that if I spoke the word arsenic out loud in that house, your father would have ridden into town that night and shot Cyrus Whitlock down in the street. And Cyrus Whitlock would have had 4 men with him, and your father would have died, and you would have had no one in the world. So I said nothing, Mercy said. And your father knew anyway. He did not need me to tell him. He knew. He sat with your mother's body for 2 days. He did not eat. He did not sleep. And on the 3rd day, he stood up, and he took you in his arms, and he packed a bag, and he came to me, and he gave me a letter to send to a woman in Texas, a sister of his, named Hester. And he said to me, Mercy, I am taking my daughter east. I am putting her where this man cannot reach her. I am going to bury my wife tomorrow, and then I am leaving, and I will be back when the child is old enough to be safe, and not 1 day before. And he did. He buried your mother. He left the next morning before sunrise. He took you to Texas. He left you with his sister. And he did not come back to Stillwater Bend for 10 years. Wren felt the room go very still around her. She could hear the candle. She could hear the wind. She could hear Mercy's breathing slow and shallow, the breathing of a woman who had carried a stone in her chest for 10 years and was now setting it down on a table. He came back in August of 1882, Mercy said. Just 2 months ago. He came at night. He did not ride into town. He came on foot over the ridge the way a man comes when he does not want to be seen. He knocked on this door after midnight. I almost did not know him. He had grown a long beard, and the years had cut his face into a face I almost did not recognize. He sat in the chair you are sitting in now. He drank a cup of coffee, and he told me what he had come to do. He had spent 10 years child, 10 years moving from town to town, working in mines, saving every dollar, building a case. He had spoken to men in Tombstone and in Prescott and in Tucson who had crossed paths with Iris Whitlock. He had a name in his pocket of a federal marshal in Prescott who he believed could be trusted. He had come back to Arizona to finish the thing he had not been able to finish 10 years before. And he told me that night, sitting in that chair, that if anything happened to him, I was to wait.
He said until a young woman came to this town asking questions. Wait, and then tell her everything. He said she will come, Mercy. She will come because she is her mother's daughter, and her mother would have come. And then he stood up and he went out the door, and I never saw him again. Mercy stopped speaking. Her hand was trembling under Wren's hand. The candle had burned down by half. He went up to the mine, Wren said. I do not know where he went, Mercy said. I know that 2 weeks later, the story began to move through the town that Silas Halloway had been seen in the hills, and that he had gone into the old shaft on Lot 73, and that the shaft had taken him. That was the word they used. The shaft took him. A natural collapse, they said. The old wood gave way. Just like in 1872, when the shaft had first collapsed and the mine had been abandoned. Just an old shaft doing what old shafts do. But it did not collapse on its own in 1872, Wren said. And it did not collapse on its own this year. No, Mercy said. It did not. Wren sat for a long time without speaking. She looked down at the candle. She looked at the silver locket resting against the front of her dress. She thought of her mother, a woman she had spent 10 years remembering as a thin, pale ghost in a white nightdress, dying quietly in a small room. She thought of that woman riding up into the hills alone with a hammer and a chisel. She thought of that woman sitting on a porch and looking up at Cyrus Whitlock and telling him no 3 times in a voice that had not shaken. Iris Halloway. Not Mrs. Silas Halloway. Iris Halloway in her own hand. I am not who I thought I was, Wren said. She said it quietly. She was not sure she had meant to say it out loud. No, Mercy said. You are not. You are who your mother was. And your mother was a woman that man could not break by buying her, and could not break by frightening her, and could only break by killing her. He will try to break you the same way, child. He will try the money first. He has already tried the money. He will try the fear next. And when the fear does not work, he will try what he tried with her. Wren raised her head.
She looked across the candle at the old woman, and the old woman looked back.
"Then I had better find what is in that mine," Wren said before he tries it.
She walked back to the cliff above town just before dawn, with the eastern sky going a thin, pale color over the ridge, and the air still cold from the desert night. She lay down in the meadow grass beside the slide of rock, and she slept for 2 hours with her shovel across her chest like a soldier sleeping with a rifle. When she woke, the sun was already hot on her face. She sat up. She looked at the slide. She looked at her own raw hands. And she stood up, and she began again. The next 2 weeks passed in a kind of fever. In the mornings, Wren walked the 3 miles down to town, and she worked at Mrs. Polk's boarding house. She scrubbed the front porch on her hands and knees. She washed sheets in a wooden tub behind the kitchen until the lye soap ate the skin off her knuckles. She carried buckets of well water until her shoulders burned. Mrs. Polk paid her 15 cents a day and let her eat the leavings from the boarders' breakfast plates. Wren did not speak to the boarders. She did not speak to Mrs. Polk except to say, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am." She kept her head down and her hands moving, and she watched and she listened. She learned things in those 2 weeks. She learned that Cyrus Whitlock had a wife named Lenora who had died of a fever in 1874, and that he had never remarried. She learned that he owned the bank, the mercantile, the saloon, the freight company, and 3 of the 4 producing mines within 20 miles of town. She learned that the town marshal Thaddeus Renshaw had been appointed to his position 11 years ago with Whitlock's backing and had been reappointed every 2 years since. She learned that no man in Stillwater Bend would speak ill of Cyrus Whitlock in a room where anyone else could hear, but that in private, in the kitchens and the back rooms and the alleys behind the saloon, men spoke his name the way they spoke the names of weather and disease, with a small, careful flinch. In the afternoons, she walked back up to the mine and she dug. She dug with the second-hand shovel until the wood of the handle was dark with her blood and the blade was bent at the edge. After the first week, she had earned enough to buy a pickaxe at the mercantile, a smaller one second-hand again, with a hickory handle that had been spliced in the middle and rebound with wire. She paid for it with 60 cents in small coins. The clerk did not meet her eyes when he took the money. She walked back up the hill with the pickaxe across her shoulder, and she began to work the slide in a different way. She had stopped trying to clear it all. She could not clear it all. Instead, she had begun to dig along the upper edge of the slide near the place where the cliff face had broken away, looking for the original line of the shaft, looking for the place where the rock had fallen from. She worked by reading the slide the way her mother must have read the country. She watched how the timbers lay. She noticed which rocks had been broken by the fall itself, and which rocks had been broken before by a hammer, by a drill. She let her hands tell her the story, and on the 9th day, near the top of the slide, 10 feet up from the meadow grass, and 4 feet in from the cliff face, her pickaxe struck a beam of wood that did not behave like the other beams. The other beams were gray, with 10 years of weather splintered soft with rot in places. This beam was not. It was harder. Its surface was darker, almost black, the color of wood that has been kept out of the sun. The axe marks at its end were sharp and clean, not the dull, crumbled edges of old wood that had finally given way. The beam was set crosswise in the slide, wedged between two large stones, in a position that no natural collapse would ever have produced. It was a brace. It was a thing that had been put there. Wren cleared the dirt away from the beam with her hands. She brushed the surface of the wood, and then she saw the carving. It was on the underside of the beam, where a hand had reached up and made the marks long before the beam had been set in place. The carving was small, no bigger than the palm of her hand. The letters were cut deep, the kind of deep cut a person makes when they want something to last. They were sharp and unweathered, protected by the position of the beam from a decade of sun and wind. I 1871. Wren sat back on the slide. The sun was high and the rocks were hot beneath her, and she sat with her two raw hands resting on her knees. And she looked at her mother's initials cut into the wood of the beam that had held up her mother's mine, and she did not move for a long time. Her mother had stood here. Her mother had set this beam. Her mother had taken a knife, perhaps the same knife she used to cut bread in their small kitchen, and she had carved her name into the wood the way a woman writes her name in the first page of a book she does not intend to lose. Iris Halloway, 1871. Not Silas Halloway, not Mrs. Silas Halloway. Iris. And then someone had taken the same beam 10 years later and had used it to seal the place shut. Wren reached up and she pressed the flat of her palm against the carving, and she held it there the way Mercy had held her hand the night before. The wood was warm from the sun. She could feel the small grooves of the letters under her skin. "I am here, Mama," she said. The wind moved across the meadow. She said it again, quieter. "I am here." 3 days later, the gunman came. Wren had been working since first light. She had cleared a small, dark hole at the top of the slide just above the place where her mother's beam was buried, a hole barely wide enough for her shoulders. She had pushed a stick into the hole, and the stick had gone into the length of her arm without striking anything. There was empty space behind the slide. She did not yet know how much. She had stopped digging in the late morning when the heat had grown impossible, and she had walked down the track toward the spring at the lower end of the meadow to refill her father's tin canteen. The track from the meadow ran along the side of a low ridge for half a mile before it dropped down into the wash that led back to town. On one side of the track was the ridge rising steep and broken. On the other side was a sharp drop of perhaps 30 feet into a dry, stony gully. There was no shade. There was no cover. Wren had walked the track a dozen times by then, and she walked it now with her canteen empty in her hand,
and her shovel left up at the mine and the pickaxe across her shoulder. She was halfway along the ridge when the first bullet struck the rock beside her head. The sound came after the strike, a sharp crack from somewhere up on the ridge above her. Stone chips spattered against her cheek. She felt the warm wet of blood before she felt the cut. She did not think. Her body did the thinking. She dropped flat to the dust of the track and rolled toward the only piece of cover she could see, a low outcrop of red rock at the edge of the drop. The second bullet struck the dirt where she had been standing. The third bullet whined off the outcrop above her head as she pressed herself into it. She lay against the warm stone, and she breathed in shallow gasps, and her mind, which had gone strangely empty, began to fill again. There was a man on the ridge above her. He was perhaps 100 yards away, maybe less. He had a rifle. He had not missed by much, and he had not missed by accident. He had missed because she had moved, and he had not expected her to move so quickly. The next shots would not miss. She looked up the track. The ridge ran for another 200 yards before it bent. There was no cover between her and the bend. She looked down at the drop. 30 feet of jagged rock into a gully full of stones. A broken leg at the bottom of it at best. A fourth shot struck the outcrop. A piece of red rock the size of her fist broke loose and tumbled past her face. She pressed herself flat. She thought, this is how it happened to him. This is how it happened to my father. He came down this track, and he never reached the bottom, and they told the town that the shaft took him. And then, from somewhere across the gully, from somewhere up on the opposite ridge, a different rifle spoke. The sound was deeper than the first rifle, slower, the heavy bark of an older weapon. The bullet did not strike near Wren. It struck somewhere up on the ridge above her, somewhere near the man who had been firing at her. And Wren heard a man's voice cry out, a single short cry that was as much surprise as pain. The first rifle went silent. There was a long held breath of a moment, and then the older rifle fired again and again, 4 heavy shots spaced out like the slow beat of a drum. And Wren heard faintly the sound of boots scrambling on loose rock above her, the sound of a man retreating fast. She did not move. She lay against the outcrop with her face pressed into the warm dust, and she counted to 100 slowly. When she had counted to 100, she counted to 100 again. The desert around her was silent. A single hawk called somewhere very high. Then a voice came across the gully, hoarse and old. "Girl, you hit." Wren raised her head an inch. Across the gully on the opposite ridge, a figure had stood up out of a clump of mesquite. He was an old man, thin and bent, with a battered hat pulled low and a long gray beard. He held a rifle across his chest. Even at that distance, Wren could see that he was swaying. "I am not hit," she called back. "Then get yourself moving," the old man said. He is going to come back with friends. You go up to that mine of yours and you wait for me there. I am coming over."
Wren got to her feet. Her legs were not steady. She picked up her pickaxe where it had fallen in the dust, and she walked as fast as her legs would carry her back along the track toward the meadow and the mine. She did not look back. She heard behind her the slow, heavy steps of the old man making his way down the far ridge and across the gully and up after her. He reached the meadow 20 minutes later. By then, Wren had drawn the pickaxe close beside her, and she had crouched in the shadow of the cliff with her back to the cool stone, and she had watched the track. She did not know yet whether the old man was a rescuer or another kind of killer, and she had made up her mind that if he came around the bend with his rifle raised, she would meet him with the pickaxe. But he came around the bend with the rifle hanging loose in one hand and the other hand pressed against his left side. The front of his shirt beneath the pressing hand was dark and wet. He walked to the edge of the meadow. He stopped. He looked across at her in the shadow of the cliff. "Crane," he said. His voice was thinner now than it had been from the ridge. "Josiah Crane. You will have heard the name. Most folks call me the drunk under the cottonwood." Wren stood up slowly. She lowered the pickaxe. "You are hit," she said. He took 2 more steps into the meadow. He swayed. He went down on one knee in the grass and then onto both knees, and then he sat down hard and the rifle fell out of his hand into the meadow grass beside him. "He caught me with the second shot," Josiah Crane said. "He was not as bad a marksman as I hoped. Help me up to the mine, girl. I do not want to die out here in the open where everyone can see." She got him up to the dark hole at the top of the slide. It was the only shelter she had. She got her shoulder under his arm, and she half carried him up the loose rock of the slope, and she pushed him through the narrow opening she had cleared, and she crawled in after him. There was a small chamber on the other side of the slide, no bigger than a pantry, the space where the original collapse had not fully filled in. The air was cold and smelled of stale stone. There was just enough room for the 2 of them to sit with their backs against the rock wall. She had a tin cup and the last of the water in her father's canteen. She gave Josiah the water. He drank a swallow and he handed the cup back to her. The wet patch on his shirt had grown. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was already thinner. "There is not much time and I have a lot to say. Will you listen?" She nodded. "Cyrus Whitlock paid me $50, Josiah said in the fall of 1872, to seal this mine. He told me there had been a collapse. He told me that the man inside your father had been killed in the collapse, and that the body could not be recovered, and that the family did not want the shaft to remain open as a hazard. He told me there was ore inside that was not safe to leave for thieves to dig up. He told me a great many things. He paid me $50, and he gave me a wagon load of timbers, and he showed me what he wanted me to do. I did it. I worked for 3 days. I sealed this mine with my own hands. I drove the braces. I packed the dirt. I made it look like a natural slide. And then I took my $50 and I walked into the saloon and I started drinking, and I have not really stopped drinking from that day to this. He paused. He coughed once, and the cough brought a small, bright bead of blood to the corner of his mouth. I knew, he said. I knew that night. I knew it was not right. A man does not pay another man $50 to bury a body that nobody is supposed to find. A man does not pay another man $50 unless he is buying that man's silence as well as his back. I knew, and I told myself I did not know, and I drank to make the knowing go quiet. For 10 years I have drunk to make it go quiet, and then 2 months ago a man came into the saloon, a man with a beard and old clothes, a man I had not seen in 10 years, but whose face I recognized the moment he sat down. Your father, Silas Halloway. He sat down beside me at the bar, and he did not say a word for almost an hour. He just drank his coffee and watched me. And then he leaned over and he said, quiet only for me, Josiah, you remember the work you did for Cyrus Whitlock in October of 1872? And I said yes, and he said, you are going to help me undo it. And I said yes. I do not know why I said it. I had been afraid of Cyrus Whitlock for 10 years, but I looked at your father, and I said yes. What did he ask you to do? Wren said. He asked me, Josiah said, to keep watch. He told me he was going up to the mine and that he was going to find a way in. He told me he had certain things he needed to recover and certain people he needed to reach. He gave me a key. He gave me a key, and he told me that if anything happened to him, if he did not come back to town within a week, I was to take the key, and I was to use it on the door of my own root cellar behind my cabin under the cottonwood tree. There is a chest in that cellar, he told me. The chest is mine. What is in the chest, you will know what to do with when you see it, but until then, do not open it, and do not let anyone know it is there. That is what he told me. He did not come back within a week. He did not come back at all. And I drank, girl. I drank for 2 months. I drank and I watched. And I told myself I was waiting, and I do not know what I was waiting for. And then today, I saw a man come into town that I have not seen in 11 years. A man named Hollis Pike. He used to ride for Cyrus Whitlock in the early days before things in Stillwater Bend got polite. He used to do the things Cyrus did not want done in the open. He came in on the morning stage from Tombstone, and when I saw him, I knew what he had been brought here for, and I knew where he would go, and I took my rifle, and I rode out before he did. Josiah's voice had grown so quiet that Wren had to lean toward him to hear it. The wet patch on his shirt had spread up under his arm. His face in the dim light of the chamber had gone the color of cold ash. "The key," he said. He fumbled at the front of his shirt with a hand that did not want to obey him. He pulled out a small iron key on a leather thong. He worked the thong over his head. He held the key out to her, and his hand was shaking, and she took it. "The chest," he said, "under the floor of the cellar. There is a plank that lifts up. You will find it." He gave a small laugh that was almost a cough. "Sorry, girl. I am sorry it took me 10 years. I am sorry I did not. I am sorry." His head fell forward slowly onto his chest. His breath came out in one long, slow sigh, and then his breath did not come back in. The rifle lay in the meadow grass outside the opening, where she had not been able to drag it in with him. The wind moved through the dry grass. Wren sat in the cold chamber with the old dead man beside her, and she closed her hand around the key, and the iron was warm from his body. She buried Josiah Crane that night in the meadow above the mine in a shallow grave. She dug with her aching hands and her broken shovel, because she did not dare carry his body back into town. She set a single flat stone on top of the grave. She did not have anything to write his name with. She knelt beside the stone and she said his name out loud 3 times into the desert dark, so that the wind would carry it somewhere, so that he would not go entirely unmourned. Then she went back to the chamber, and she lit her lantern, and she began to widen the opening in the slide. She worked through the night, and through the next day, and into the night again. She did not eat. She drank from the trickle of the spring. She worked with the pickaxe and with her bare hands, and the opening grew, and beyond the small chamber where Josiah had died, she found the true shaft of the mine narrow and supported by old timbers her mother had cut, and it ran back into the cliff for 30 feet before it ended in a wall of packed earth and stone. She worked on the wall. She did not stop. She thought about her mother. She thought about her father. She thought about a small dead man in a shallow grave above the meadow. She thought about the key on its leather thong around her neck next to her mother's locket. She thought about Cyrus Whitlock sitting in a leather chair by a low fire, and she swung the pickaxe. Just before dawn on the 3rd day, the pickaxe broke through. A puff of stale dead air came out of the hole, smelling of old dust and old stone and something else, something faint and dry and organic, the smell of a thing that had been a body once and had finished a long time ago with being a body. Wren stood for a moment with her face turned away. Then she widened the hole with her hands. She lifted her lantern. She pushed her shoulders through the opening. The lantern light moved across the inner chamber, slowly picking out one thing at a time. The walls of the shaft shored up with the old patient timbers. A miner's pick leaned against the wall, its head red with rust. A second lantern broken on the floor. 3 canvas sacks against the far wall, heavy bulging, the canvas darkened to almost black with age. One of the sacks had been torn open, perhaps by a rat, and through the tear, the lantern light struck something that gave the light back in small, hard glints, the unmistakable yellow shine of native gold caught in quartz. And against the wall, opposite the sacks, half sitting and half slumped, with its back against the timbers and its bone hands resting in its lap, was the body. The clothes were a miner's clothes, a faded canvas shirt and heavy duck trousers. The boots were high-laced, the leather cracked and pulled tight against the bone of the foot. Wren brought the lantern close to the boots. On the side of the right boot, just above the ankle, 2 letters had been burned into the leather with the hot tip of a nail. H. She knelt down beside the body. She did not weep. The weeping had left her 3 days ago in Mercy Tolliver's house, and it had not come back. She looked at the bones of the hands resting in the lap. She looked at the skull tilted slightly to one side, as though the man had fallen asleep in a hard chair. She reached out very slowly, and she laid her hand on the canvas of the shirt over the place where his heart had been. "I came," she said. "I came, Papa. I am sorry it took me so long." She sat with him for a long time. The lantern burned. The chamber was very quiet. And then, because she had not yet finished what she had come to do, she lifted the lantern again, and she let the light move across the chamber a second time. And she saw the thing lying on the floor beside the body, half tucked beneath the bony hand that she had not noticed at first. It was a book. A small leather-bound book, the cover stiff and curled with age, the leather darkened almost to black. She picked it up carefully. The cover had a single word stamped on it in faded gold letters. Ledger. She turned to the first page. The first page was a column of dates and numbers and names written in a small, precise hand that was not her father's hand. It was the hand of a man who had been trained as a clerk, the hand of a man who had spent his life keeping accounts. The first date was March of 1871. The first name was a name Wren did not recognize. The first number was a sum of money. Beside the number in the column at the right edge of the page was a single word. The word was paid. She turned the page. More dates, more names, more numbers. Some of the names she did not know. Some she did. Marshall Thaddeus Renshaw, $20, paid. Marshall Thaddeus Renshaw, $50, paid. Marshall Thaddeus Renshaw, $100, paid. The same name again and again, year after year, the sums slowly growing. She turned more pages. There were judges named in those pages. There were 2 county sheriffs. There was a federal land agent. There was a witness in a court case in Tucson who had been paid $200 to forget what he had seen. There were 3 other men whose names Wren did not know, whose deaths were noted in the margins in a different hand. A hurried hand beside small sums of money paid out to other men, whose names were noted only by initials. Near the back of the book, she found a date she knew. October 14th, 1872. Beside the date, in the same precise clerk's hand, was a single line. I. Halloway, disposed. And beside that line in the margin, a hurried note. $200 to Dr. M. Certificate of Consumption. And on the very last page that had been written in near the bottom in the same clerk's hand was a date only 2 months old. August 30th, 1882. S. Halloway, disposed. And in the margin, the same hurried note. $50 to J. Crane, seal of shaft. Wren closed the ledger. She held it against her chest with both hands. In the small yellow circle of the lantern light, in the cold air of the shaft where her father had died, and her mother's first beam still held up the roof, she sat beside the bones of Silas Halloway, and she finally understood what she was holding. She was not holding a journal. She was not holding the private grief of a dead father. She was holding the private bookkeeping of Cyrus Whitlock himself, the careful account he had kept of every man he had bought and every man he had killed, an account her father had somehow taken from him and had carried up into this mine and had died holding. She was holding the thing that would burn the Whitlock empire to the ground. She put the ledger inside her dress against her skin beside her mother's locket and Josiah Crane's iron key. She picked up her lantern. She crawled back through the opening in the slide and out into the cold dark of the meadow, and she stood up in the wind, and she looked down the long dark slope toward the small yellow lights of Stillwater Bend in the valley below. In a fine large house at the edge of that town, a single light was burning in a window on the second floor. Wren knew with a certainty that she could not have explained whose window it was. She stood in the meadow with the wind in her hair, and she looked at the light, and she said one word quietly to no one but the desert. Soon. The storm came down out of the high country 2 days later, and it came down fast, the way storms come in the desert in late summer, with no warning except a darkening of the western sky and a sudden cold edge in the wind. Wren had spent the day at the mine, sitting beside her father's bones in the lamplight, reading the ledger from front to back and back to front, memorizing the names, the dates, the small, precise sums. She had wrapped the book in a square of oilcloth she had cut from the old tarp at Josiah Crane's cabin. She had wrapped it again in a piece of canvas cut from one of the ore sacks. She had buried it 3 feet down beside Josiah's grave in the meadow under the flat stone she had set there, because she had understood that the ledger was the only thing in the world that mattered now,
and she could not carry it with her into a town where Cyrus Whitlock had eyes on every door. She had come back down to the mine, and she had begun to dig her father a proper grave inside the chamber where he had died. That was when she heard the first roll of thunder. She came out of the shaft, and she looked west, and she saw it. The whole western horizon had gone the color of a deep bruise, blue-black at the bottom and angry red-orange at the top, where the late sun was still trying to push through. The clouds were not moving the way clouds move in pleasant weather. They were boiling. She could see even from 3 miles away the long gray sheets of rain already falling against the far ridge. The wind moved across the meadow ahead of the storm cold and quick, flattening the dry grass. She was halfway through tying down the canvas over the mine entrance when she heard the screaming. It came from down the wash, faint at first, almost lost in the rising wind. A woman's voice, a child's voice underneath it. Wren stopped with the rope in her hands. She listened. The voices came again. She dropped the rope and she ran. She ran to the edge of the meadow where the track dropped down toward the dry wash that led back to town. The wash, which had been a stony, empty trough that morning, was no longer empty. A wall of brown water 4 feet deep was already moving down it, churning with the bodies of small, uprooted juniper trees and broken brush and rolling stones. And in the middle of the wash, perhaps 200 yards downstream, a wagon lay tilted on its side against a boulder. One of its wheels was already gone. A man was clinging to the high side of the wagon with one arm and holding a small boy of perhaps 5 years against his chest with the other. A woman in a dark dress was crouched on the wagon seat above him, holding onto the brake handle, her face white with terror. The water was rising. Wren could see it rising. The rain had not yet reached this part of the country, but the rain was falling somewhere up in the high country. And the wash was carrying it down. And the water was rising at a speed that did not seem possible. Wren turned, and she ran back to the mine. She seized a coil of rope from the supplies inside 40 feet of it heavy hemp that her mother had bought 12 years before, and that had been waiting in the dark all this time. And she ran back to the edge of the wash. She tied one end of the rope around the trunk of a stunted juniper that grew at the lip of the drop. She did not test the knot twice. She did not have time. She tied the other end around her own waist, and she let herself down over the edge of the drop, and she half climbed and half slid down the loose face of the bank into the wash. The water hit her at the knees, and it was colder than she had expected, and it pulled at her with a hungry strength that almost took her legs from under her. She set her feet against a stone. She held the rope tight. She worked her way along the edge of the wash, sometimes wading in water to her thighs, sometimes climbing over slick boulders, and she fought her way down toward the wagon. The water rose to her hip. It rose rose toward her chest. She could feel it pulling at the fabric of her dress, trying to fold her into itself and carry her down the wash to wherever it carried things at the end of its run.
She reached the wagon. The man saw her. His face beneath the brim of his soaked hat was a face she did not know, a face she would remember for the rest of her life. He did not speak. There was no time for speaking. Wren untied the rope from her waist, and she passed the end up to him. "Take the boy," she shouted. "Tie it around the boy." The man took the rope in shaking hands. He tied it around his son. He passed the boy down to Wren, and Wren took him, and she fought her way back along the edge of the wash, with the small, wet, warm weight of the boy clinging to her neck, and the water pulled at them, and the rope which she had tied to the juniper held. She got the boy up the bank. She untied the rope. She climbed back down. She came back for the woman. The woman could not move at first, frozen on the seat. Her hands locked around the brake handle. Wren had to climb up onto the broken wagon and pry the woman's fingers off the handle one by one, speaking to her quietly, the way a person speaks to a horse that has gone past the place where it can hear words. She got the woman down into the water. She tied the rope around the woman. She fought her way back to the bank a second time. She climbed up. She untied the rope. She climbed back down. She came back for the man last. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye. The water was at his neck. The wagon was beginning to shift against the boulder. She had to half drag and half carry him along the edge of the wash, and twice the water lifted them both off their feet, and twice the rope around his waist
took the strain and held them, and Wren thought with a strange, quiet clarity, Mama, that this rope, where I could reach it. Mama bought this rope 12 years ago and put it in the back of this mine, and now it is here.
She got the man up the bank just as the storm broke over the meadow, and the rain came down in solid silver sheets. She led the three of them, the man and the woman, and the small wet boy up to the mine, and she got them inside the chamber. She had cleared the dry chamber with the lantern still burning, and her father's body wrapped in the canvas she had taken from the ore sacks, and she gave them her last blanket. She gave them the last of her bread. She built up the small fire she had been keeping at the chamber entrance, and she sat with them through the long roaring night of the storm, and the wind moved against the cliff outside, and the rain came down, and the wash below ran brown and full, and finally began to fall again toward morning. The man's name was Eldon Vance. The woman was his wife, Sarah. The boy who fell asleep at last against his mother's side, with his small fist closed around a corner of Wren's blanket, was named Caleb. They had been coming up from Tucson. Eldon said quietly while his wife slept. They had a brother of his with a small farm 20 miles east of Stillwater Bend, and they had been driving up to see him. They had taken the cutoff to save half a day, and they had not known the wash. They had not known that a storm 40 miles north could put water in a dry wash in 20 minutes. He looked at her in the firelight. His face was thin and weathered, the face of a man who worked hard and did not say much. There were tears in his eyes. He did not pretend that there were not.
You saved my son, Eldon Vance said. You saved my wife. I do not have words for what you did. I do not have anything to give you. But I will tell you, miss, that the name of Wren Holloway is going to be a name people speak in this country for a long time. I will see to it. I will see to it as long as I live.
Wren did not answer. She put another piece of mesquite into the small fire. She looked at the sleeping boy, his cheek against his mother's shoulder, and she thought of her own mother, and she did not trust herself to speak. By the next morning, the storm had passed, and the wash had fallen, and the sun had come back up over the country, and the country had begun to dry. The Vance family walked down the track toward town with Wren behind them. She wanted to make sure they reached help. She wanted also to see what the storm had done to Stillwater Bend, because she had begun very quietly inside herself to make her plan. They came into town in the middle of the morning. People were on the boardwalks. People were standing in the doors of the buildings talking in low voices about the storm, about the wash, about a freight wagon that had been lost 20 miles to the north with a driver they all knew. And then they saw the Vance family coming up the dusty street, soaked and tired and bandaged at the head, with a thin, dark-haired girl walking behind them. And Eldon Vance stopped in the middle of the street, and he turned around, and he pointed at Wren, and he said in a voice that carried down the whole length of Stillwater Bend, "This girl saved our lives. This girl pulled my wife and my son out of the wash with her own hands. You ever speak ill of her again in this town, you will speak ill of her to me first." People came out of the buildings. Mrs. Polk came out of the boarding house with a towel in her hands and her mouth open. The blacksmith came out of his shop. The clerk from the mercantile stood in the door of the store. They all stood in the dusty street, and they all looked at Wren for the first time since she had walked into Stillwater Bend, was looked at not with pity and not with mockery, but with something else, something like awe.
Cyrus Whitlock did not come out of the mercantile. The door of Whitlock and Company stayed closed, but the curtain in the window on the second floor of his fine, large house at the end of the street moved very slightly, and then it was still.
Wren walked back up to the mine that afternoon. She walked alone. The town watched her go, and it was a different kind of watching now. She did not stop at the mine. She walked past it down a thin path that ran north along the base of the ridge for a quarter of a mile, and she came to a small cottonwood tree growing out of a crack in the rocks, and beneath the tree was a small slumped cabin made of mud bricks
and weathered planks. And this was Josiah Crane's cabin. And Wren had Josiah's iron key on the leather thong around her neck.
The cabin was empty. Wind had blown through the broken window. A bottle lay on the table half full of cheap whiskey. A coat hung on a nail. Wren did not stop to look at any of it. She went to the root cellar at the back of the cabin, a low door set into the side of the hill, and she put the iron key into the lock, and the lock turned stiff but willing. The cellar was small. A few jars of pickled vegetables gone bad years ago sat on a shelf. The floor was hard-packed dirt with a layer of straw on it. Wren knelt down. She brushed the straw aside with her hand. She moved her palm slowly over the dirt of the floor, the way her mother had taught her to read a country. And after a moment, her fingers found what she was looking for. A plank set flush with the floor, almost invisible, only the faint edge of it showing under the dirt. She worked her fingers under the edge. The plank lifted. Beneath the plank was a shallow space, perhaps 2 feet deep. In the space sat a small wooden chest, no bigger than a child's lunch pail, bound with iron bands. She lifted the chest out. She set it on the dirt floor. The chest had no lock. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in clean, dry cloth, were 3 things. The first thing was a folded sheet of paper sealed with wax. The paper had been written on by her father. She knew the writing the moment she saw it. The letter began, "To whoever finds this, my name is Silas Halloway." And it went on for 2 close-written pages, describing in cold, patient detail everything her father had learned in 10 years of moving from town to town. Every man Cyrus Whitlock had hurt, every man he had bribed, every man he had killed. It was a sworn statement, signed and dated, written in the voice of a man who knew he was about to die and had decided to leave a record. The second thing was a hand-drawn map. The map showed the country east of Stillwater Bend with a single trail picked out in red ink that ran north and west across the high desert. At the end of the trail, at a town drawn as a small square of black ink, 3 words were written: Prescott, U.S. Marshal. The third thing was a folded telegram form, blank, with a name and an office written in her father's hand at the top. Augustus Crowder, United States Deputy Marshal, Office of the U.S. Marshal, Prescott, Arizona Territory. Wren sat in the cellar with the chest open at her knees, and she looked at the 3 things her father had left for her, and she finally understood the shape of what he had been doing in the last weeks of his life. He had been building a case. He had been building it slowly and carefully and alone, and he had been building it for a single specific man, a federal officer who answered to no one in this corrupt little corner of Arizona Territory. And he had been killed before he could put the case into that man's hands. Now she was going to put it there for him. She had no money. She had nothing she could sell. But Josiah Crane had an old roan mare in a small corral behind the cabin, a thin, patient animal who had not been ridden in a year, and Josiah Crane was past needing her. Wren saddled the horse with Josiah's worn saddle. She filled a canteen at the spring. She wrapped her father's letter and the map in oilcloth. She dug up the ledger from beneath Josiah's grave, and she wrapped it too, and she stitched both wrapped bundles inside the lining of her dress with a needle and thread she had taken from Mrs. Polk's mending basket. She told no one. She told Mercy. She rode out of the meadow above Stillwater Bend at dusk, with the dust of the trail rising behind her, and she rode north and west into the high country, and she did not look back. She rode for 3 days. She rode through country that no white woman ever rode through. A lone country of red mesas and yellow grass and dry canyons where the only sound was the wind and the small clatter of the horses' hooves on stone. She slept at night beside small fires of dry mesquite, with her father's saddle as her pillow and the horse hobbled close beside her. She did not see another human being for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day, she met a Papago man riding south on a small pony, and he raised his hand to her in greeting, and she raised her hand to him, and neither of them spoke, and they passed each other without stopping, and the man's face, calm and dark and watchful, stayed with her for the rest of the ride. She came into Prescott on the afternoon of the 4th day, gray with dust, her dress stiff with sweat, her face burned by the sun, her lips cracked open from the dry wind. Prescott was a real town bigger than Stillwater Bend by 20 times, with brick buildings and a courthouse and a railway and shops with glass windows. She rode the old mare down the wide main street, and people stared at her, and she did not care. She asked a boy outside a stable where the office of the United States Marshal was. He pointed her down a side street. She rode to the office, and she got down off the mare, and she walked inside. A young deputy at the front desk looked up at her. His face changed when he saw her. He started to ask what her business was, and she said, "I have come to see Marshal Crowder. I have come from Stillwater Bend." And the deputy stood up slowly, and he said, "Miss, you wait right here." He came back 2 minutes later with another man. Augustus Crowder was perhaps 60 years old, a tall, thin man with a long gray mustache and the still, careful eyes of a man who had spent his life looking at people and deciding very quickly what they were. He wore a black coat. A silver star was pinned to his vest. He did not smile when he saw Wren. He did not need to. He looked at her dust-caked dress and her sunburned face and the way she was holding her hand pressed against the side of her dress where she had stitched the bundles into the lining, and he said very quietly, "Miss, you come into my office and you sit down." She sat down in a hard wooden chair across a wide oak desk. He poured her a cup of water from a pitcher. She drank it in 2 swallows. He poured her another. She drank that one slowly. He did not speak while she drank. He waited. He was a man who knew how to wait. When she was done with the second cup, she set it down on the desk, and she said, "My name is Wren Halloway. My father was Silas Halloway. He was killed in Stillwater Bend in August of this year by a man named Cyrus Whitlock. My mother was Iris Halloway. She was killed in the same town in February of 1872 by the same man. I have proof. I have it sewn into my dress. I rode 3 days to bring it to you. I do not know any other person in this country I can trust." Augustus Crowder did not move for a long moment. Then he leaned forward very slowly, and he set his elbows on the desk, and he laced his fingers together, and he said in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Miss, I have been waiting 5 years for someone to walk into this office and say the name Cyrus Whitlock. I have been waiting 5 years, and I have begun to think it would never happen. You take whatever is sewn into your dress, and you put it on this desk, and you tell me everything. Take your time. Start from the beginning. I am not going anywhere," she told him. She told him for 2 hours, and he listened, and he did not interrupt once. She unstitched the bundles from her dress with a small knife he gave her, and she set the ledger and her father's letter and the map and the telegram form on the desk between them. He read the letter first. He read the ledger second. When he turned the page where the name of Marshall Thaddeus Renshaw appeared for the first time, his face did not change, but his fingers, which had been resting flat on the desk beside the book, slowly curled into a loose fist. When he turned to the page near the back where the entry for August 30th, 1882 was written in the precise clerk's hand, he stopped reading. He closed the ledger. He laid his palm flat on top of it. "Miss Halloway," he said, "you have done a thing that very few grown men could have done. You have brought this office, the case it has needed for 5 years. I am going to take a posse of federal officers, 8 men, all of them mine, none of them bought, and we are going to ride back to Stillwater Bend with you tomorrow morning, and we are going to take Cyrus Whitlock into federal custody, and we are going to bring him to Prescott to stand trial in a federal court. And the verdict in that court is not going to be a verdict that any of his money can buy. I am telling you this now so that you know it before you sleep tonight. I am telling you so that you can sleep." Wren looked at him across the desk. The light from the office window was beginning to go gold with the late afternoon. She had not cried in front of anyone since the night in Mercy Tolliver's house. She did not cry now. But she nodded once slowly, and she said, "Thank you, sir." And then she said, "There is one more thing I have to ask." He waited. When you take him, she said, I want you to take him at the mine. I want you to take him at the place where my father died. I want him to stand in that meadow when you put the irons on him. I want him to look at the cliff. I want him to know that I dug it open. I want him to know it was me. Augustus Crowder looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once.
Miss Halloway, he said, it will be done as you ask.
They rode back into the country east of Prescott 2 mornings later. Crowder ate federal deputies Wren on Josiah's old mare. They rode hard. They camped one night under the stars in a hollow of red rock, and the deputies who had been polite and careful with Wren at first had grown by the second day into a kind of grave, silent escort men who looked at her now the way men look at something they have not seen before and have decided to respect. They came down out of the high country on the afternoon of the 3rd day, and Stillwater Bend lay in its valley below them, small and indifferent in the sunlight, with the smoke of its chimneys rising thin and straight into the still air. They did not ride down into the town. They circled north the way Wren guided them, and they came up onto the meadow above the cliff just as the sun was beginning to slip toward the western ridge. Wren got down off the old mare. She walked to the edge of the meadow. She looked down at the slide of rock and timber she had spent 5 weeks tearing open. She looked at the dark hole at the top of it, where her father's bones lay wrapped in canvas in the cold quiet of the chamber. She looked at the small, flat stone in the meadow grass where Josiah Crane was buried. Crowder sent 4 deputies down into town with instructions to ride straight to Whitlock and Company and tell Cyrus Whitlock that a federal marshal required his presence at the mine on Lot 73 immediately. They were to be polite. They were to be firm. They were not to draw their weapons unless they had to. They did not have to. Cyrus Whitlock, when the deputies walked into his mercantile, was sitting behind his counter in his clean gray duster with his silver watch chain across his vest. And he listened to what they said, and his face did not change. And he stood up, and he put on his cream-colored hat, and he walked out of his store and got onto his horse and rode up the track toward the meadow without a word. It was Marshal Thaddeus Renshaw who did the thing none of them expected. The deputies riding back up to the meadow with Cyrus Whitlock between them had to pass the marshal's office on their way out of town. Renshaw was standing on the boardwalk in front of the office. He had clearly seen the federal deputies ride into town. He had clearly understood what their presence meant. He was a thin, gray man of perhaps 55, with a thin, gray mustache and the tired eyes of a man who had been carrying something for a long time. He stepped down off the boardwalk into the street as the deputies and Whitlock rode past. He held up his hand. The deputies stopped. Cyrus Whitlock did not look at him. Renshaw walked up to the lead deputy. He reached inside his coat. The deputy's hand moved to his pistol, but Renshaw drew out only a folded envelope. He held it up. "I would be obliged," Renshaw said quietly, "if you would carry this to your marshal, and if you would also carry it to the Halloway girl." There is a letter inside addressed to her. I would ask her when she reads it to think of me without too much hate. I have not earned more than that from her. I am not asking for it." He pressed the envelope into the deputy's hand. He turned around. He walked back to the boardwalk in front of his office, and he climbed the 2 steps, and he opened the door of the office, and he walked inside. The door closed behind him.
The deputies looked at each other. They were beginning to turn their horses toward the office when the shot came from inside. A single shot. The flat, short crack of a service revolver. The horses startled and danced sideways. The deputies sat very still in their saddles. Cyrus Whitlock, who had not turned his head once during the entire exchange with Renshaw, did not turn his head now. He looked straight ahead up the track toward the meadow above the town, and his face had gone a color that was not quite white and not quite gray, the color of old candle wax. They rode the rest of the way up to the meadow without speaking. Wren was standing at the edge of the meadow with Crowder beside her when the deputies came up the track. She watched them come. She watched Cyrus Whitlock come sitting straight in his saddle, his hands tied at his wrists with a length of soft rope, his hat still on his eyes, fixed straight ahead. The deputies brought him to a stop at the edge of the meadow. They got him down off the horse. They walked him forward across the meadow grass, past the small flat stone where Josiah was buried, to the place at the foot of the slide where Wren and Crowder were standing. He stopped in front of Wren. For the first time in 2 months, his pale gray eyes looked directly into hers. His face was perfectly composed. He had recovered in the long ride up from the town whatever had failed him at the sound of the shot from Renshaw's office. He looked at her now as he had looked at her on the steps of the land office on the day of the auction, with a small, thin smile. A smile that suggested that the world was a foolish place, and that the two of them, he and she, were the only 2 people in it who understood the joke. "You have caused me a considerable amount of inconvenience, Miss Halloway," he said. Wren did not answer. Behind Cyrus Whitlock, the deputy who had received the envelope from Renshaw stepped forward. He held the envelope out to Crowder. Crowder took it, opened it, read the short note inside, and then unfolded the second sheet of paper that was tucked into the envelope. He read that one too. His face did not change. When he was done, he refolded the second sheet, and he handed it across to Wren. She took it. She did not open it then. She put it inside her dress. Crowder looked at Cyrus Whitlock. "Mr. Whitlock," he said, his voice flat and quiet, "you are under arrest for the murders of Iris Halloway in February of 1872 and Silas Halloway in August of 1882, for the bribery of public officials, for the corruption of judicial proceedings, and for the additional homicides of 3 persons whose names are recorded in a private ledger now in my possession. You will be transported to Prescott to stand trial in federal court. You have the right to retain counsel of your own choosing. Do you understand the charges I have just read?" "I understand them perfectly," Marshal Cyrus Whitlock said. "I look forward to defending myself against them in open court."
Wren looked at him then. She looked at him for a long time. She did not speak. The wind moved across the meadow. The shadow of the cliff had begun to lengthen out toward them across the meadow grass. Above them, somewhere very high, a hawk wheeled in the late sun. "Take him away," she said quietly.
The trial of Cyrus Whitlock began in the federal courthouse in Prescott on the 22nd day of October, 1882, and it ran for 9 days. The courtroom was full every morning. Men came up from Tucson and from Phoenix and from as far away as Yuma to watch it. The newspapers in Prescott and in Tucson and in Denver printed daily accounts. Cyrus Whitlock had retained a lawyer from San Francisco, a tall, sleek man named Ambrose Pell, who had a reputation for finding holes in the cases of small-town prosecutors. Ambrose Pell, on the first day of the trial, looked at the ledger laid on the table of evidence, and his face very briefly became the face of a man who had walked into a room and discovered that the floor was not where he had expected it to be. The prosecutor was a federal attorney named John Reeves. He called his witnesses in order. He called Augustus Crowder, who explained how the case had come into federal hands. He called Mr. Ainsworth, an independent miner from up near Jerome, who examined a sample of the ore from the chamber inside the mine and testified under oath that it was tellurium, or of an extraordinary grade, the kind of vein that a man would commit a great many crimes to control. He called Mercy Tolliver, who had been brought up from Stillwater Bend in a covered wagon despite her 78 years, and who sat in the witness chair small and straight, with her hands folded in her lap, and who told the court in a dry whisper that the bailiff had to ask her to raise twice about Iris Halloway and about the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, and about the night Silas Halloway had come back to her house in August of 1882 and had sat in her chair and had drunk her coffee and had told her what he meant to do. He called Eldon Vance, who told the court how a thin girl had come into a flooded wash with a rope around her waist and had pulled his wife and his son out of the water with her own hands, and who said when asked by Ambrose Pell whether he could possibly speak to the character of Wren Halloway after only one night in her company, that he could speak to her character because he had watched her tie a rope around his 5-year-old son with hands that were calm, and that there were not very many people in the world whose hands were calm in that kind of moment, and that he would believe what such a person said over the word of any rich man in any city as long as he lived. He called Wren herself last. She sat in the witness chair in a plain dark dress that Mercy Tolliver had pressed for her with her hair pinned back, and her mother's silver locket worn outside her collar where the jury could see it. She was 17 years old. She answered every question that the prosecutor asked her, and she answered every question that Ambrose Pell asked her, and she did not raise her voice once. She told the court about the letter in the tin box in Bandera, Texas. She told the court about the auction. She told the court
about the $200 Cyrus Whitlock had offered her on the steps of the land office. She told the court about the carving on the underside of the beam, IH 1871. She told the court about Josiah Crane and about the gunman on the ridge and about the chest in the root cellar and about the ride to Prescott. She did not embellish. She did not weep. She did not look at Cyrus Whitlock, who sat at the defense table in a clean suit with his hands folded in front of him the entire time she was on the stand. On the 9th day, John Reeves rested his case, and Ambrose Pell rose to make his closing statement. And Ambrose Pell, who had spent 8 days trying to find a hole and had not found one, began to speak. He had not been speaking for 2 minutes when it happened. Cyrus Whitlock stood up. He stood up slowly, the way a man rises from a long dinner, his pale gray eyes fixed on Wren across the courtroom. Ambrose Pell stopped mid-sentence. The bailiff at the back of the room began to move forward. Cyrus Whitlock's right hand moved up the cuff of his left sleeve very quickly, in a motion that was so smooth and practiced that no one in the room understood what they had seen until it was already done. The small, thin knife that had been hidden in the seam of the sleeve was in his hand, and he was crossing the floor of the courtroom toward Wren in 3 long strides. Wren did not freeze. Wren did not scream. Wren saw him come, and the small hot coal that had been burning inside her chest since the bench beside the church in Stillwater Bend flared up suddenly into a clear, bright flame, and her hand, almost without her thinking, found the only thing on the long oak rail in front of the witness chair that was not bolted down. The wooden gavel that the judge had set there at the beginning of the morning session while he conferred with the clerk about a missing exhibit. The gavel was a heavy thing, a head of dense oak the size of a small apple set on a turned handle. Wren brought it up and across in a single hard arc, the way her mother, whom she had never seen swing a hammer, must have swung a hammer all those years ago in the high country above Stillwater Bend. The head of the gavel struck Cyrus Whitlock's right hand at the wrist with a sound like a rifle stock breaking. The knife went flying. It clattered across the wooden floor of the courtroom and came to rest under a spectator's bench. Cyrus Whitlock cried out a single short cry of pain and pure astonishment, and he stumbled backward, and the 2 deputies behind him caught him and bore him to the floor, and the bailiff was on him, and the courtroom was on its wheel, and in the middle of all of it, Wren Holloway stood up out of the witness chair with the judge's gavel in her hand, and her dust pale face perfectly still. And she looked down at the man who had killed her mother and her father and 3 other men. And she said in a voice that carried very clearly across the suddenly silent room, "Sit down, Mr. Whitlock. The court is not done with you yet." The jury returned its verdict the following afternoon after a deliberation of 1 hour and 20 minutes. Cyrus Whitlock was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to be hanged. The hanging took place in the yard behind the federal courthouse in Prescott on the 4th day of November, 1882. Wren did not attend. She had been asked. She had said no. She spent the morning of the hanging in the small hotel room she had taken at the edge of town, sitting in a chair by the window with her father's letter unfolded in her lap and her mother's silver locket open on the small table beside her, and the tiny lock of dark hair tied with red thread laid out on a white square of cloth in the morning sunlight. She did not read the letter. She had read it many times by then. She only sat with it. When the church bells in Prescott rang the noon hour, she folded the letter and she closed the locket and she put both away. She went home to Stillwater Bend the next week. She did not go back alone. Mercy Tolliver was with her. So was Eldon Vance and his wife Sarah and the small boy Caleb. Augustus Crowder rode down with them and stayed for 3 days and then rode back to Prescott. Wren bought a small house on the edge of town with money that the federal court had ordered released to her from Cyrus Whitlock's seized accounts, a sum that the court had determined to be a partial restitution for the deaths of her parents. She did not buy a large house. She did not buy fine furniture. She bought a small adobe with a wooden porch and a single old cottonwood tree in the yard 2 doors down from the house where Mercy Tolliver lived alone. The rest of the money she had ordered, placed in trust for a specific purpose. She announced the purpose 2 weeks after she came home at a small meeting held in the dining room of Mrs. Polk's boarding house. She intended, she said, to build a free school for the children of the miners in the country around Stillwater Bend, a school that would teach reading and writing and arithmetic, and also the practical arts of the country, the reading of ore samples and the use of tools and the survival of weather. The school would be open to every child in the county, regardless of the means of their family, regardless of whether they were the children of the men who worked the mines, or the women who washed the laundry of the men who worked the mines. The school would have a name. The name had already been chosen, and it was not negotiable. The school would be called the Iris Halloway School. The building of the school took the better part of a year. It was finished in the autumn of 1883. On the evening before the school opened, Wren went up to the meadow above town one more time. She went alone. The sun was low over the western ridge, and the light on the red rocks was the soft, long gold of evening. The mine was sealed again now, but it had been sealed properly this time with a clean new door
and a strong lock and a brass plaque beside the door that gave the name of the claim and the year and the names of the 2 people who had first worked it. Iris Halloway, Silas Halloway. The plaque was small. It was enough.
She walked across the meadow to the small fenced enclosure she had built that summer. At the upper end of it, beneath the shade of 2 new juniper trees she had planted herself. Inside the enclosure were 2 stones. They were the same size. They were set side by side 6 inches apart, their faces turned toward the western sun. The stone on the left said simply, Iris Halloway, 1842 to 1872, beloved. The stone on the right said, Silas Halloway, 1840 to 1882, beloved. There was nothing else carved on either stone. There did not need to be. She had brought her father's bones up out of the mine 3 months ago. She had brought her mother's bones up out of the small, forgotten plot at the edge of the town cemetery, where they had lain alone for 11 years. She had buried them here together at the edge of the meadow her mother had first walked into in the spring of 1871, looking for what the country had hidden. Wren knelt down between the 2 stones. She set her hand on the top of her mother's stone first. Then she set her hand on the top of her father's stone. The stones were warm from the day's sun. She did not speak. She did not need to. She had said everything she had to say to them in the long, quiet nights of the past year. She knelt between them, and she felt the wind move across the meadow, and she watched the long shadow of the cliff begin to fall across the grass, and she stayed there until the sun had slipped down behind the western ridge, and the first cold edge of evening had come into the air. She heard footsteps behind her then, soft, slow, careful footsteps in the grass. She did not turn around. She knew who it was. Mercy Tolliver came up beside her. The old woman did not kneel. Her knees had stopped letting her kneel 2 years ago. She stood beside Wren in her black dress, and she looked at the 2 stones, and after a long moment she spoke. "You brought them home, child," Mercy said. Wren shook her head. She kept her hand on her father's stone. She looked up at the place above the western ridge where the first star of the evening had just begun to show. "No," she said, "I did not bring them home. I only stopped letting them be forgotten." She stood up then. She brushed the meadow grass off her knees. She offered her arm to Mercy, and Mercy took it, and together the 2 of them walked slowly back across the meadow toward the track that led down into the valley. Below them, in the town of Stillwater Bend, lamps had begun to come on in the windows of the houses. The yellow squares of light scattered themselves across the dark like seeds dropped in a field. Somewhere down there, in a small new schoolhouse that smelled of fresh pine and chalk dust, a wooden sign was waiting to be unveiled in the morning. The sign carried a woman's name. The woman had died 11 years before. The woman would not be forgotten now. The wind moved through the canyon below them, the long, slow wind of the autumn country. It carried with it the smell of mesquite smoke and dry sage and turned earth. It carried also very faintly the small, high sound of a child laughing somewhere far below. Wren paused on the track. She listened. The laugh came again. She smiled very slightly, and then the smile faded into the quiet, still expression that her face wore. Most often these days, the expression of a woman who had learned very young that the world was not the world she had been told it was, and who had decided to keep walking through it anyway. She and Mercy walked on down the track toward the town. Behind them in the meadow, the two stones stood side by side in the long blue dusk. The wind moving softly over them, the first stars coming out one by one in the wide, clear sky above. Below, the lamps of Stillwater Bend burned warm against the dark, and the long, quiet country of the Arizona Territory turned slowly toward the night.